Oh, come on. Do you really think you can beat me as I am now? Fool!
Leaves shook and branches rustled. His head throbbed, his chest caved, his vision went black, but he could still see the eyes. The glowing eyes, the mask, the shaking. He held his head and screamed, but he made no sound. Leaves shook and branches rustled. There was no other sound. In the darkness, he felt pain. He felt the twisting, weaving, contorting pain of muscles where they did not belong. He felt there should be silence in this black space, but the sound of trees deafened him. Leaves shook and branches rustled. They smothered him. He opened his eyes, and he was buried. He saw foliage and bark and twine and eyes. He always saw the eyes. He struggled to pull himself out of a tomb made just for him. He strained to reach an escape that simply did not exist. He reached for help that would never come. Leaves shook and branches rustled. They drowned him. The trees trampled and suffocated him. He could see nothing but the shaking of the leaves, the twisting of the branches. It was so loud in his long ears. When he screamed, he had no idea if he made no sound or if his nightmare's volume swallowed his own. They enveloped him, and he could not move. He thrashed, but it made no difference. He gasped for air, but his lungs were gone. He panicked, grasping at his throat. His skin was not flesh. Leaves shook and branches rustled. They changed him. Pain engulfed him like wildfire. His veins ignited, and his limbs did not belong to him. The eyes in the distance mocked him. The sound of the trees burrowed into his ears like worms. He swatted them like flies, desperate for release, and they abated. He turned and ran, holding his face in his hands, in hopes that if he did not look at them, they would prove to not be real. Leaves shook and branches rustled. The trees were part of him. The eyes followed him always. He slammed his eyes shut and returned to the blackness of his mind, praying to whatever goddess might listen that this was only a nightmare. Agony alighted his face, so strong that he had to swallow the bile that came to his mouth. He felt his body twisting and contorting until he did not know where his soul rested. The leaves shook as loud as a tornado whipping right past him. They quaked and rippled, and the sound in his mind was no longer of leaves, but of his muscles changing shape against him. The branches rustled as intensely as a giant stampeding through a forest. Tiny twigs snapped and large stems cracked, and the sound he knew now belonged to his bones as they cracked and curved. He yelled at the top of imaginary lungs that no longer sat in a fleshy chest, but yet again, he made no sound. Leaves shook and branches rustled. The eyes would always watch. The trees chased him until he could run no longer. Nothing felt right. He did not know how to move. Everything ached, and his body was wrong. His limbs were short and his skin was rough. His vision saw limited color, and when he reached for his long Hylian ears, they were no longer there. His mouth grew dry and his body did not breathe. In his panic, he clawed at the bark that covered his arm. He scratched and dug with all his might, but he drew no blood. He closed his eyes and fell to his knees, fear taking its hold. When he opened them, he stood again before those wicked eyes. He looked down, and in the water, he saw his own reflection. He did not see himself. He should have felt his heartbeat hard against his chest, but he could feel nothing. He should have breathed harder and faster, but his chest was empty. He shook his head in disbelief, hoping that the imposter would not copy his movements. But he did. He screamed, and at last he made sound. The Skull Kid laughed. Leaves shook and branches rustled. The eyes glowed. The Skull Kid laughed.
You've met with a terrible fate, haven't you?